Susan Smith, and I'm a librarian at the Long Branch Library. I'm here with Caitlin McCarthy, who's a librarian at the Gaithersburg Library. She has renamed herself Technical Difficulties, so if you have any issues with Zoom, please consider sending her a chat message to Technical Difficulties. We welcome Susan Philpott of the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument. She's here in honor of Women's History Month to talk with us about the Equal Rights Amendment and the evolution of equality over the past century. Now, this program, unlike most of our programs, is being recorded, and you'll notice that we have automatic live transcription at the bottom of your screen. If that is annoying to you, you can turn that feature off on your individual device. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan, and Caitlin and I are going to turn off our cameras, but we're still here and you can reach us through chat.
Well, hello, everybody. As Susan said, I'm Susan Philpott, and I am a park ranger at the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument. I am actually joining you from my home, although my background is on Zoom is showing you the Hall of Portraits at the museum. So you can see I'm kind of framed by the beautiful stained glass window there, and there's paintings and statues behind me, and I'm wearing my park ranger uniform today. Don't get much opportunity to wear it anymore. I'm very glad to do it now and to get to talk to everyone. So I'm going to share my screen here. So we'll be walking through some pictures, both of our museum and to highlight this story, and also words which I'll read to you that are on the screen. My pronouns are she and her, and today I'm going to be talking about the Equal Rights Amendment. Oh, but my screen isn't forwarding, so I'm going to try again here. Let's see. Let's try from here. There we go. So this is the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument. It's a 3-story brick house on the corner of Constitution Avenue and 2nd Street Northeast, right near the Capitol. We're across Constitution Avenue from the Supreme Court building, and the building that you see behind the house there is the Hart Senate Office building. So we're right in the heart of everything. Like all the land in Washington, D.C., this house is located on land used by the Natchkink or Anacostans for hunting and trading. And since 1929, it has been the headquarters of the National Woman's Party, founded by Alice Paul. And so today we're going to be talking about the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm showing a picture of a display case in the museum with some of our ERA buttons on display. And I want to mention that I'm going to be talking about the history of the Equal Rights Amendment. I am not advocating one way or another about anything that should happen with the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm just telling you the story. As a National Park Service site, we do support the concept of women's equality. So I am coming from that perspective, but not advocating for any particular action towards women's equality. And I really, I think we can really say that people of goodwill can disagree about the methods of how you get somewhere, and we're gonna explore that a little bit. I can't tell the whole story of the Equal Rights Amendment, as we'll discover. It's nearly 100 years old, but I'll be telling some of the stories. And as we go through, I'd love it if you put in the chat, in addition to any questions you might have, any perspectives or memories you have about the ERA. And if you'd like, I'd invite you to put into the chat right now, when I say Equal Rights Amendment or ERA, what associations does that bring up for you? what memories do you have about the Equal Rights Amendment? And you can just reflect on that for a minute as we continue. So I'm now showing a black and white photo of that entranceway to the Belmont-Paul house. This is a picture from 1974. And when I look at this, I think of a quote from one of the National Women's Party members. She said, "It's not merely a headquarters for our party that we plan, but an embassy for the women of the nation, a center of thought and activity, and a vantage point from which they may keep Congress under perpetual observation." So the position of the House is not an accident. They are putting themselves on Capitol Hill for a good reason, because they want to stay in the faces and on the minds of the people in power to remind them of the issue of women's equality. And this is a picture of what the museum looks like now, with the, again, still you can see it's very similar to the way it was during the time that Alice Paul herself was living and working there. The statue on the, or the bust on the left there, farthest away from the viewer, is Alice Paul. We have other notable leaders here with paintings on the walls. And then this picture is looking in the other direction, away from the window. Closest to you can see a bust of Susan B. Anthony, some other portraits on the wall. And on my screen, the box is covering it up. I don't know if you can see, I shared this picture to be able to share that you also, there's also a statue of Joan of Arc there. So that when you're in that space, you know that this is not just a space for women, but for warriors. And we're going to talk about all the ways that they, these women fought for equality. So the big story we tell in this museum is the thing that Alice Paul is best known for, which was the fight for women's right to vote, for women's suffrage. And that moment is often marked with the origins with the Seneca Falls Convention in July 1848. I've got up here the founding document that was created at that meeting, a historic meeting, the Declaration of Sentiments, where those gathered there to talk about the issue of women's rights put down their intentions, their mission statement, and they declared all men and women are created equal, modeled on the Declaration of Independence. Now, the text on this document is too small to read. I'd invite you, of course, to look it up if you're interested. But what you can tell is there's a lot on this document. It doesn't just say women should have the right to vote. Their intention was to address all the ways that women were treated unequally. And in 1848, that was a pretty long list. As you can imagine, the vote was only one of the things, actually maybe the most controversial thing on the ballot, on the document. This is a picture from Women's Rights National Historic Park in Seneca Falls. You can, if you go there, you can walk along the Declaration of Sentiments wall and see that long list of demands that they had on the Declaration of Sentiments. Eventually, though, as the fight for women's rights continued over the decades, those who were working for equality really began to hone in on the idea of the vote, that once you have the ballot, you've got the power to work on all of the other things. And in the 20th century, that's where the story that we tell at Belmont-Paul picks up, which is the women who not only were focused on the vote, but on a constitutional amendment as the way to secure that vote. And the picture I've got up now is showing one of the tactics that they used in that fight in getting the constitutional amendment, the thing that the National Women's Party was perhaps best known for, which was picketing the White House. So we've got a lot of women. It's a black and white photo, so you can't tell, but they're wearing tri-colored sashes of purple, white, and gold, and also carrying banners in that purple, white, and gold in front of the White House. This is a picture from Maryland Day. So all of the women shown in this picture are from Maryland. I don't know if the woman roller skating by is part of the protest. That would be cool though. But the idea was to get Woodrow Wilson to support the amendment. That was the thing that was going to get it through Congress and out to the states. They were changing public opinion. That was the way they were going to make sure that women across the country could vote. And it was a long, hard fight. And finally, there is victory in August of 1920. Here we see some of those banners that they carried when they were picketing the White House from our museum. One says, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" The other one says, "The young are at the gates. You know, we are the new generation of women demanding our rights." And this is a picture of one of the suffragists, all in white, wearing her tricolored sash, standing at the White House gate with one of their rallying cries on a banner: "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" So the idea of the vote as the path to full liberty and equality. So now I've got a picture of Alice Paul standing in front of a purple, white, and gold banner, although it's in black and white, with stars indicating that all of the states have ratified that amendment, and she's holding aloft a wine glass to toast their victory in getting that amendment to the US Constitution ratified. I am told that in that wine glass is actually grape juice, because before the 19th Amendment, enfranchising women, there was the 18th Amendment, which made alcohol illegal. I don't know what that says about our country, that we wanted to outlaw alcohol before agreeing that women should have the vote. But that movement of prohibition was a very women-driven movement. So an indication that even without the vote, women know how to get things done, and that there are lots of issues that are important to women. It's something to remember that women are half of the population. So there is often, and after this vote, women won the vote, there was this idea that somehow there's a women's plank. But as we will say, women come from all sorts of political persuasions. So I just want you to think for a moment and imagine a time in your life when you had incredible success or a victory, that you accomplished something that you had worked really hard for, what that felt like, and what did you do? Some of these women said, "Victory, yay, that's enough public involvement for me. I'm going back to my normal life. We've won the vote and we're done." Not Alice Paul. Alice Paul said, "It's incredible to me that any woman should consider the fight for full equality one. It has just begun. There is hardly a field, economic or political, in which the natural and unaccustomed policy is not to ignore women. Unless women are prepared to fight politically, they must be content to be ignored politically." So that is the place that she's coming from. We got to fight, and we've got to fight in the political arena if we want things to change. The vote is not the end. The vote is just the beginning. And so the National Women's Party decides to continue their work. They do a lot of different things. They become lobbyists. They work in the international arena. They support women running for office. And in 1922, they make their own list. After the Declaration of Sentiments, now we've got the vote, now we have to reassess. And again, this is a document that the text is too small to read, but you can get the sense with every large T on the list. There's another thing that women are saying in 1922 is not fair to women. They still got a long list of things. And here's one of how the document begins. It says, "Whereas women today, although enfranchised, are still in every way subordinate to men before the law, in government, in educational opportunities, in the professions, in the church, in industry, and in the home." So we might have the vote, but every other way we are unequal. And there's a political cartoon here by Nina Allender that shows a ghostly Susan B. Anthony holding up the Bill of Rights to two women, modern women who have the vote in their hand. And the title of it is "Everything But the Vote is Still to Be Won." And the next section of the Declaration of Principles says, "Be it resolved that as a part of our campaign to remove all forms of the subjection of women, we shall work for the following immediate objects." And then there's a long list. And the first thing on the list says that women shall no longer be regarded and shall no longer regard themselves as inferior to men, but the equality of the sexes shall be recognized. And I added the emphasis that women should no longer regard themselves as inferior to men. This idea that women had internalized the socialization that says they were not equal. There's another political cartoon from Nina Allender here showing illustrating the distribution of government plums. And while both a boy and a girl are labeled as citizens, the boy's getting the plums and the girl is being denied them. So in 1923, it's the 75th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention. So the National Women's Party has a big convention and Gardens of the Gods, Colorado, in which they enacted lots of pageants about the story of women warriors, for example, as you see in this picture, you know, as you do, dress up as warriors, to mark the history of what had come before and to set the stage for what was coming next. And that is when the National Women's Party announced their intention that, you know, getting laws changed and getting women elected is good, but what we really need to do is go back to the Constitution and amend it again. It's not just enough to have the Constitution say women have to have the vote. We also need to say that women need equality right there in the Constitution. And they call it the Lucretia Mott Amendment. Lucretia Mott, who's pictured here on the right, was one of the other organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. She was working on women's rights before anybody was calling it that, and is seen sort of as the mother of the movement. And so they name this the Lucretia Mott Amendment. And the initial wording is, "Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and in every place subject to its jurisdiction." And in December 1923, it is introduced in Congress. I've got a picture up of the actual document itself, introduced in the House of Representatives and in the Senate at the same time, with that wording on it. It was introduced by these two men, both Republicans from Kansas. On the left is Representative Daniel Reed Anthony Jr. That Anthony is to tell you that he was the nephew of Susan B. Anthony. And on the right, you see from a scrapbook, a newspaper clipping of Senator Charles Curtis, who introduced it in the Senate. And Charles Curtis actually would go on to become vice president, and he was a great supporter of women's equality. So it's introduced in both houses of Congress. They begin to hold hearings, and at those hearings, the National Women's Party stands up and gives testimony in support of adding women's equality to the Constitution, and nobody else does. This is a picture I'm showing of some of the leaders of the League of Women Voters, the much larger National Suffrage Association became the League of Women Voters when women won the vote. And League of Women Voters had a lot of things on their platform of things they were working for women, but they didn't think the Equal Rights Amendment was a good idea. They were very much against it, as was just about every other women's organization. And this was pretty upsetting to Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. And this is Alice Paul's assessment later when she was reflecting on this, what she saw. from that. She said, so then we saw that our problem would not be the Senate and Congress and the president, because now we were voters and had the power. It will be changing the thought of the American woman. So in Alice Paul's assessment, at least, women had so internalized this idea that they were inferior, that they couldn't even imagine themselves having equal rights in the Constitution. And maybe this is the reason that the National Women's Party doesn't start a campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment like they had for the 19th Amendment. So there were no big marches, there were no picketing the White House, nobody was disrupting Congress or getting arrested for protesting. Maybe they're tired, they'd been doing that for 7 years, they were worn out, but also maybe Alice Paul saw that that's not the way to go now, because we're never going to convince the politicians if we can't convince the women themselves. So she did a number of different things. She got more involved in international women's rights. She went to law school. She already had a PhD, but she decided if she was going to make legal arguments that she should have a law degree as well. She didn't, though, even though she's saying the problem is with women themselves, she didn't really do that much about reaching out to women, these other women's groups, to talk to them about why they wouldn't support this. And, you know, a big part of it was that one of those movements that women had been involved in was the labor movement. And something that women in labor had been able to accomplish that they saw as a real progress was protective labor legislation for women. So laws requiring how many hours women could work, the conditions under which they could work, limiting child labor, trying to make things safer for women. Now, it's interesting that this legislation seemed constitutional while other more broad limits on labor at the time had been labeled by the Supreme Court unconstitutional, interfering with contracts. But why could you make those laws for women? Well, because the state has an interest in women's bodies, because women bear children. And so the state could make rules about what could happen for women because as a nation, we care about what happens to women's bodies. Interesting precedent. Now here's Alice Paul's response to that. This is another political cartoon that's showing a woman with two young children kind of surrounding her, and she's looking at a sign on a door that says protection about this labor legislation. It says, motherhood is the noblest profession in the world, therefore you must be given the inferior jobs, the lowest pay, and your hours to work shall be limited. And then in parentheses, it says, except in the home. So what Alice Paul and the National Women's Party's argument is, if you have laws that treat women differently than men, then what you are saying is that women are inferior and need to be protected. And what that has the effect of doing is meaning that women aren't treated fairly by being protected. And to Alice Paul, the fact that the Equal Rights Amendment would probably do away with this protective labor legislation, she thought was a good thing. Yes. If there should be protective labor legislation, it should be for everybody, not just for women, because that's treating women unfairly. That was easy for her to say. She didn't work at a factory, and she didn't really reach out to labor leaders to find out, well, what do we do? The National Women's Party would reach out, say, to Black women's groups, because National Women's Party was primarily a white women's organization, for their support for the Equal Rights Amendment, but she didn't put her support behind their issues, like an end to racial violence. She'd reach out to Native American women's activists, but then she didn't support the idea of voting rights for Native Americans. So she wasn't doing a very good job, it doesn't seem, of making those connections, of making common cause with people with differing ideas. Of course, it isn't just people who are concerned about the welfare of women who are against the Equal Rights Amendment. This is a picture of a card from the National Women's Party's lobbying records. They kept a card on every single member of Congress and recorded their interactions. That was a lobbying innovation that they came up with. And this is the notes from an interview with a Republican senator from New Hampshire, George Moses, who is marked as opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment in June of 1929. And he says he thinks it is a fool amendment is through putting embroidery in the Constitution. So embroidery is this very feminine thing that's kind of frivolous. No more of this frivolous women's stuff in the Constitution anymore. You got the vote. I'm not really sure that was a good idea, but you should just be satisfied with that. Well, one of the things that happens from Alice Paul's time in law school and also in working with politicians is she is convinced to change the wording of the Equal Rights Amendment. And you might notice a shift in tone with this new wording. And this is the one that's still around today. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So shifting it from a positive assertion of rights to sort of this is where you can't deny rights. You're going to deny rights that can't be based on sex. That's the idea behind this one. It's the same, mirrors the language of the 19th Amendment and also the 15th Amendment that forbids denial or abridgment of the right to vote based on race. Something that even in 1943, states are doing a pretty good job of ignoring. So by the time this change is made, actually both political parties bring the Equal Rights Amendment on as part of their party's platform. So it's a bipartisan idea. Yes, we support the Equal Rights Amendment, which by this time they're not calling the Lucretia Mott Amendment anymore. They've started calling the Alice Paul Amendment. It looks like this amendment might pass by 1950. And it's coming up for a vote in the Senate. And suddenly, as it's just about to pass, we get a rider to it. What becomes known as the Hayden Writer in 1950 that says the provisions of this article shall not be construed to impair any rights, benefits, or exemptions now or hereafter conferred by law upon persons of the female sex. Well, that's basically saying equal rights, except when you don't have equal rights. And those who've been fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment are appalled. What are you doing? And this comes from Senator Carl Hayden, a Democrat from Arizona, who had been in the Congress since Arizona had become a state. He would go on to serve until 1969, and was instrumental in the creation of Grand Canyon as a national park. But he had a concern about the Equal Rights Amendment. And when was asked, why did he add this rider? He said, in the beginning, God made them different. When male and female created he them. So basically, look, you can't be equal because you're different. That was his answer. So the Equal Rights Amendment passes through the Senate with the Hayden Writer attached to it. And so then when it goes to the House of Representatives, the women who had fought for the Equal Rights Amendment, suddenly they can't support it. No, you can't put that rider in that. That's negating everything that we're trying to do. So with the addition of the rejection of the rider and those who are just opposed to it altogether, It doesn't pass in the House. It passes again in 1952 in the Senate, again with the rider attached, but not in the House of Representatives. But it brings up all these things that are the tension that's going on with this kind of fundamental issue that comes up when we talk about women's equality. How do we reconcile this concept of equality with difference? And it's interesting, when Susan was introducing me at first, she said you were the Belmont-Paul Women's Equity National Monument, which we're not, the Women's Equality National Monument. But what's that difference between equality and equity? Recognizing differences and making things equitable. If anybody wants to put any comments in the chat, please do. To be fair, it wasn't only older white men opposing the Equal Rights Amendment. This is a picture of Polly Murray, who was a lawyer and civil rights activist, very much a feminist, involved in the feminist movement. But she didn't support the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, she had coined the term Jane Crow as a way to sort of explain something that Black women have been talking about for a long time, what we now call intersectionality. This idea that Black women, women of color, face sort of issues from two sides, right? They face oppression and struggle because they are women, and also because they are women of color. And Polly Murray, as a lawyer, opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, not because she opposed equality for women, but because she said women are already in the Constitution. We're there in the 14th Amendment, which requires due process and equal protection under the law for all citizens. And so she said, the problem is we're not getting the courts and the laws to recognize what the 14th Amendment says. So if you put the Equal Rights Amendment in there, what you're doing is you're sort of peeling off sex and leaving everything else out that they're already ignoring about what the Constitution should protect. And so in a correspondence with a National Women's Party member, Alma Lutz, she says, and so we differ not so much in our objectives as in our strategy. So I'm not against equality, but how do we get there? Now, one of the things that does happen along this time, as the Equal Rights Amendment is not really going anywhere, although I should say from 1923, it is introduced into every single Congress. And it still is introduced into every single Congress, but not much happening. But what is happening in the nation is a growing civil rights movement to finally start to address those things that the 14th Amendment is supposed to protect and doesn't, and the 15th Amendment are supposed to protect and is not happening. That African Americans should have due process, equal protection, the right to vote. And kind of the culmination of the civil rights movement, at least legally, for that time period, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's a clause in Title VII that talks about discrimination in employment. And it says you cannot discriminate in employment based on race, color, religion, national origin. And many feminists, including the National Women's Party, fight to get the word sex included in there. And so now suddenly there's not supposed to be, at least in employment, there's not supposed to be discrimination based on sex. This Civil Rights Act establishes an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that's supposed to enforce that part of the Civil Rights Act. And this is a picture of Sonia Pressman Fuentes, who I believe still lives in Montgomery County in Maryland. I got this photo from the Jewish Women's Archive. If she's on, or if anybody who knows her is on, I hope it's okay that I'm using her photo here. she is a lawyer for the EEOC. She's a friend of Polly Murray's, and they get very frustrated that the EEOC is not enforcing discrimination based on sex in employment. You know, that they're not fighting against that. It's treated as if that word sex is just sort of thrown in there. That's not really what the Civil Rights Act is about. Of course, we don't mean women should be treated equally in the workplace. Don't be ridiculous. And as a result of their frustration, they and a number of other women found the National Organization for Women, NOW. And a big part of NOW is to push for this enforcement, and they start to get movement on that. They're formed in 1966. And then once they're starting to get movement on that, they start to think about this Equal Rights Amendment that Alice Paul had proposed so long ago that wasn't really going anywhere. Sonia Pressman Fuentes also was on the board of the National Women. So she's sort of a connection between NOW and NWP. Alice Paul and a number of National Women's Party members show up at the meeting in 1967 of NOW, where they're going to vote on whether they're going to take up the Equal Rights Amendment. There are labor leaders in NOW who are still concerned about that. But I love sort of the picture of these now elderly women among these new young at the gates, the second wave feminists who are there, sort of the elderly women with their gloves and hats who are there to vote, yes, please take up the Equal Rights Amendment. And so NOW does decide to fight for the ERA. And here is a picture of kind of that document there, the Equal Rights Amendment, which you'll notice is stamped as being passed through Congress in 1972. This new Young at the Gates, the second wave feminists, they get this amendment through. And they get it through partly by coming up with using those old tactics that the National Women's Party stopped using, but they bring them back. They have marches. They protest at the White House. They get arrested at the White House. One of my favorite protests is at the Miss America pageant, which, by the way, started in 1921, right after. And they use sashes and things, a way to sort of put women back in their place. Now, women, okay, you can vote, but remember that your real job is to look pretty. They protest at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City as a way to say that unreasonable standards of beauty are a form of oppression that we have to fight against. And so they have a freedom trash can there on the boardwalk where women throw in the articles of their oppression, like bras and girdles and hair curlers and all those things. By the way, they don't set any of those things on fire. So no bras were ever actually burned.
Susan, there's a question in the chat box.
Yes.
The march for the ERA in 1980 in Baltimore, or was it 81? I don't know if Carolyn Avery, if you want to unmute yourself, you can elaborate on your question if you want.
So I don't know about the one in 1980.
I mean, it interrupt things.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, we can. But I have some pictures of March.
It was built last March for the ERA.
I have some pictures of March. I'm going to show some pictures of marches, and then I'd love for anybody who has more stories about fighting for the ERA to jump on. So here's a picture from, oh, you know what? There's one part that I forgot to mention. I just want to notice, you can see in this resolution here, you see the wording there, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. But above it, if you notice in that joint resolution, it says that the following article is proposed and an amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislators of 3/4 of the several states. within 7 years from the date of its submission to Congress. They put a time limit on it. And I have talked to people who were at the Capitol when this passed in March of 1972, and they came over to the National Women's Party headquarters to celebrate with Alice Paul, and they found her in tears because she said that time limit is going to kill it. What they're doing is sending the message that all you have to do is oppose this for 7 years and it will go away. Nevertheless, they start out to get states to ratify the amendment, and states are ratifying one state after another. It's got bipartisan support. This is a picture from the Women's Conference in Houston in 1977. You see women marching with a torch that they have carried from Seneca Falls to Houston, that they're coming to the convention to celebrate the International Year of the Woman. There's young women in here carrying the torch. There's also a picture of Bella Abzug and Betty Friedan. And I think maybe Billie Jean King is in there too. 1977. So we're already 5 years in. And we've got some states to ratify, but we don't have them all. And this is hoping to bring some more energy to this women's movement to get this done. But there's another meeting going on in Houston at the same time by this woman, Phyllis Schlafly. And you can see on her coat there is a button that says Stop ERA. And Phyllis Schlafly has formed the opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. And she is very good at getting attention. And she's good at getting people stirred up by using incendiary language. Now that sounds like par for the course for us now. She was one of the first masters of it. But she brought up real things that people were worried about. She said, the Equal Rights Amendment, equality is not something that women want. Equality is going to pull women down off the pedestal where society has rightly placed them. And equality, in essence, is going to be oppression. I'm going to read you a couple of things she said. She said, we have the immense good fortune to live in a civilization which respects the family as the basic unit of society. This respect is part and parcel of our laws and our customs. It is based on the fact of life, which no legislation or agitation can erase, that women have babies and men don't. And she also said, the truth is that American women never had it so good. Why should we lower ourselves to, in scare quotes, equal rights when we already have the status of special privilege? Equality, oppression, equality, bad for women, bad for the family. And here is another picture of from that Stop ERA protest, which, by the way, if you notice, they are picketing the White House. They're using Alice Paul's own innovation against her amendment. And you can see on some of the signs, some of the things that people were worried about. We've got a pregnant woman holding a sign that says maternity ward, women only, and women is crossed out and it says persons only. Another sign says ERE means Amy, register for the draft at 18. This is during the time when the Carters are president. Amy Carter is their daughter. And so they're saying, you know, girls are going to have to register for the draft. Another one says, Rosalind Carter, tear up your Social Security card, not mine. So these are fears that women have, right? That their protection during their time when they're vulnerable, giving birth, is going to be violated, that women are going to have to register for the draft, that Social Security that protects women who haven't worked outside of the home and receive Social Security benefits based on their husband, that's going to be thrown out, that we're going to have all the things, right? Social, political, economic, where we're working for equality, they're saying, no, this is going to be bad. This is going to hurt you. This is going something to be afraid of. And Phyllis Schlafly was good at making people afraid, and she was also good at making people angry. We see that all the time now. She was one of on the front lines of this. In fact, when I've been trying to find quotes from her, I often have trouble finding a quote that just states her position clearly, because there's always some little dig in there that's meant to stir people up. And it works. There's this, just as happened to the suffragists 50 years before, now women who want the ERA are treated as somehow deviant and disreputable, those crazy women's libbers. They're trying to ruin things for good, respectable, and as you can see from this picture, it looks like all white women. Because this idea of being privileged and protected, well, I mean, who really has those privileges and protections, right? We're talking about upper class white women. Nobody else gets those. But it works, and the support for the amendment starts to erode. This is, we asked about a march in 1980. I don't know about a march in 1980, but I'd love to hear about it. But this is a march from 1979. If you notice, they are on Pennsylvania Avenue. You can kind of see the old post office tower in the distance there. The same route that Alice Paul had led a women's suffrage procession very famously down in 1913. And everybody in the picture is wearing white, kind of the suffrage white, and they're all wearing purple, white, and gold sashes, so, and carrying purple, white, and gold banners. So echoing back to Alice Paul and the suffragists, they are marching for the ERA. And you can see in the front here, we see Gloria Steinem, Dick Gregory, Betty Friedan. I don't know who the next woman is, unfortunately, but the woman on the far right there is Maryland's Barbara Mikulski. Long time representative, Barbara Mikulski, senator. So this is a march in 1979. Okay, so 1972 and then 7 years. All right, so we're right at 1979, 7 years. What they are successful in getting done is an extension of that 7-year time limit to 10 years. But it doesn't matter. 1982 comes around, and the amendment is still 3 states short of ratification. So 1982 looks like the amendment is dead. Here is a map color-coded with states in purple that ratified the amendment and states in gold that did not. It's from 2017, except there's one interesting thing here. 1982, the amendment is dead, right? But if you notice in light purple, here is Nevada ratifying the amendment in March 2017. Suddenly, the ERA is back in the news again. And I did check to find out what was happening in Nevada. What happened in Nevada is there was a greater percentage of women in the state legislature than in most states. It still wasn't 50%, although I think it is now. But just having more women in public office was making a difference. That was one of the things that we try to talk about at Belmont-Paul, the importance of women and girls as seeing themselves as candidates, as people who should step up and run for office. We have a mirror where you can look in and say, I will run for office. That's something that's been kind of exciting around the same time, is this idea of women seeing themselves, not waiting to be the perfect sort of superwoman, but I am someone who wants to make a difference and I'm going to step up. As Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman to serve in Congress, said, if they won't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. Okay, so that's 2017. Everybody's talking about the ERA again. And what happens? In 2018, Illinois ratifies the Equal Rights Amendment, which I think was Phyllis Schlafly's home state, by the way. And then in January of 2020, Virginia ratifies the amendment. Okay, so those were the 3 states short, right? Now we've got our 3/4 of states that have ratified it. But the Equal Rights Amendment is not part of the Constitution. So there's 2 things that have happened. One is that the Justice Department told the National Archivist, there's a time limit, the time limit expired, you cannot certify the Equal Rights Amendment as part of the US Constitution. And there's another little part. Here's a map that I got from Business Insider. Oh, I think it's taken from the equalrightsamendment.org. None of these maps are maps that I did, by the way. Here's another way of looking at it. You notice that now there are 5 states that are in a different color: Idaho, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kentucky, and Tennessee. All of those states have voted to rescind their ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Can you do that? Can a state rescind its ratification? We don't know. That's a question. There, on other amendments, there are states that later said they were rescinding their ratification, but those amendments are still part of the US Constitution. So that's something that's going through the courts. And also, you know, that indicates that Alabama, Louisiana, and South Dakota have all filed a lawsuit to block the Equal Rights Amendment. Virginia and Illinois have filed lawsuits to support their ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, that it should be part of the US Constitution. So that's where we are today. We don't know. Probably if it goes anywhere, it will end up in the Supreme Court. Now, the House of Representatives did vote in 2019 to remove the time limit. They'd have to do it again now because there's a new Congress. And Maryland's Ben Cardin is leading that same push in the Senate to remove the time limit. If they remove the time limit, will that mean it's part of the Constitution? We don't know. We'll have to see. What should we do? Should there be an Equal Rights Amendment to the US Constitution? It's an open question. Some people say, like Polly Murray said, although she did eventually come around to supporting the Equal Rights Amendment, that women's equality is already in the 14th Amendment. We don't need an Equal Rights Amendment. We just need laws and courts that support women's equality. Well, at least one Supreme Court justice didn't agree. Here is a quote from Antonin Scalia, who is no longer with us, but there are several members of the Supreme Court who kind of follow his philosophy. And in an interview, he said, certainly the Constitution does not require discrimination on the basis of sex. The only issue is whether it prohibits it. It doesn't. Which you might think meant that Antonin Scalia supported the Equal Rights Amendment, but that of course is not true. He's pictured here in a discussion at GW University with his personal friend, but maybe political, philosophical nemesis, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a very staunch supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment. She absolutely wanted to see the ERA become part of the Constitution. Although she is one that said that she didn't believe that you could just remove the time limit, that the Equal Rights Amendment needs to start all over again. Once the time limit expired, that was it. And you'd have to pass it again. She was very good at, as a lawyer, at bringing cases that argued that the Constitution already supported equality for women in some circumstances. And she did win cases, but all of the decisions are kind of muddy. Yes, you're right in this case, but it didn't seem to say that women were equal under the law across the board. So that's where we are today. Are women equal in the Constitution? Are they equal under the law? We don't know. We'll have to see. There are, even the law that says that the Civil Rights Act that says you cannot discriminate based on sex. That's a law that can be rescinded or determined to be unconstitutional. But interestingly, recently, the Supreme Court did rule that that clause in the Civil Rights Act means that you cannot discriminate against trans people in the workplace, because that would be discriminating based on sex. So that's a version that nobody who came up with that law might have been thinking about, but a new application. What I'm showing here is a picture of the banner that women in the 70s carried, that they've recently, I think now has recently rediscovered. And it says that Equal Rights Amendment on it: equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, with a bunch of people gathered around it. This was at the Women's March in 2019. And so here we are, about to hit 50 years since the amendment passed through Congress, and almost 100 years since it was first introduced. What do we mean by that word equality today? What does equality look like in the 21st century? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I would love to answer your questions and hear your thoughts. And if anybody has more stories to tell about the Equal Rights Amendment, I'd love to hear them. What questions do we have? Let's see. Okay, let's see. The first one I see that comes up, Don Liebes is saying that the ERA March that I said took place in 1979 was actually in 1978, and that the person I couldn't identify in the group of honored guests is Representative Elizabeth Holtzman from New York. Thank you very much for that. The place where I found that photo, it said it was 1979, and I think I found other references to that, but there were many marches, so it could be that that photo was from another time. They had marches and they often on August 26th, although that one I think was in July, but August 26th is the day that the 19th Amendment became part of the Constitution. But I'd love to hear about, there were lots of marches and lots of demonstrations, so I'd love to hear about more of those. And Don, that was just the first one I saw. Do you want to come off mute and talk about what you found when you were looking things up? If you'd like. No, he says no, that's fine. Okay, so if Susan wants to read me any questions, or I can start looking in the chat myself.
It doesn't look like we have a lot of questions. We just have people who definitely experienced the ERA and participated, and they shared their comments about their participation.
Great. I'd love to, if anybody, I love listening to people who come into the museum who have stories to tell about their experiences with working for equality or in marches, or things they're questioning about the movement over this time period. You know, one of the things that Alice Paul is often quoted as saying is that she said she always believed that there was nothing complicated about ordinary equality. And I have to differ with Alice Paul about that. I think when we start talking about equality, it can get very complicated. What does that mean? So I'd invite anybody who would like to either type in the chat or come off mute and let me know if you have any memories or comments that you'd like to make. What do you think? What if the equal rights, what if they do determine that the ERA should be part of the Constitution? Would anything change? No wrong answers to that question.
Well, maybe people are needing to in their lunch break. It is 1 o'clock now. So thank you so much, Susan. Really do.
It's My
How does the changing view of gender now figure into the ERA? Do you want to, can you do that one real quickly and then we'll end?
Yeah, so Laura, how does the changing view of gender figure into the ERA? That's a good question. What does the word sex mean? Does it mean something different now than in 1923? What would it mean if it was part of the Constitution? I don't have an answer to that. I would love to be something that we ponder. I see David asked what President Biden's position is on the Equal Rights Amendment. I don't know if he's said anything about his position on that. That's a good question. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Again, I'm Susan Philpott from the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument. Check us out on social media and on our website. And we have a contact us button there. If you have more questions or if you have a group that you'd like to have a ranger speak at, just get in contact with us. We look forward to the day when we can welcome you back to the museum.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.